The sun rose slowly over Lone Creek Ranch, washing the open plains in a pale gold that made every blade of grass shimmer like it carried its own secret. For most folk, morning meant another day beginning. But for Jace McAllister, it meant one more day he had to face alone. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from father to son, each man adding something of himself to the land. But now, with both parents gone and no siblings to share the load, the ranch felt heavier on his shoulders than the full weight of a herd of longhorns. The barn roof needed fixing. The south fence line had caved during the last storm, and the mare in the upper paddock was due to foal any day. Jace had been working sunrise to midnight for months, pushing himself harder than any hired hand ever would. Stubborn pride kept him going, but even he had to admit the truth. He couldn't run this place on grit alone. So, on a dusty Wednesday morning, after wrestling with the thought for days, Jace did something he'd never imagined doing. He posted a job notice in town. He rode into Cedar Bluff, the nearest settlement, a place with 1 street, 2 saloons, a general store, and a telegraph office that always smelled like warm paper and ink. As his boots hit the wooden floor of the posting board outside the general store, he felt oddly exposed, like he'd confessed a weakness to the whole town. Asking for help wasn't something McAllisters were known for. The notice itself was simple, handwritten with a steady hand. Ranch hand wanted. Room, board, and wages. Must know livestock and field work. Inquire at Lone Creek Ranch Jace McAllister. No fancy promises, no exaggeration. Just the truth. As he pinned the paper to the board, a few townsfolk glanced over, whispering. Everyone knew Lone Creek was big land for one man. Many wondered how Jace lasted this long on his own. A couple of older ranchers nodded at him with quiet respect, while a group of loafers near the saloon chuckled, betting on whether the new hire would last longer than a week. Jace ignored them. He always did. He stepped back and stared at the notice for a moment. Would anyone even answer it? He needed someone strong, someone who could mend fences, break in skittish horses, lift bales, and ride out storms. He pictured the kind of man he hoped might show up, tall, broad-shouldered, seasoned, maybe a drifter looking for steady work. Someone who could pull his own weight without needing their hand held. On the ride home, Jace replayed that imagined conversation with the future farmhand. Here's the land. Here's the work. You do your part, and we get along fine. He didn't want complications. Didn't want drama. Didn't want anyone disrupting the quiet rhythm he'd carved out for himself after so much loss. But deep down, he also felt a tug of hope he didn't name that maybe another presence on the ranch would break the silence that had begun to feel too loud. Maybe someone else's footsteps in the barn, someone else's voice during supper, would make the place feel less like a monument and more like a home again. By the time he returned to Lone Creek, the sun rode high in the sky, and Jace told himself that posting the job had been the right decision. He didn't know when someone might come knocking. Could be a week. Could be a month. Could be tomorrow. What he didn't know, couldn't know, was that the person who would arrive wasn't anything like the ranch hand he pictured. Not a cowboy. Not a grown man. Not even wearing shoes. But that part of the story hadn't begun yet. The notice fluttered on the board in town, waiting for the wind or fate to guide the right set of eyes to it. The day the farmhand was supposed to arrive began like any other on Lone Creek Ranch, quiet, warm, and dust-scented. Morning light slid across the prairie like a slow-moving river, catching the edges of the fence posts and turning them into thin lines of fire. Jace McAllister was in the barn repairing a broken latch when he heard the faint groan of the front gate swinging open. At first, he assumed it was just the wind. The old gate was notorious for being talkative, but something in the rhythm of the sound made him pause. set down his tools, and stepped. Outside, what he saw was not at all what he'd prepared. Himself forgot a figure stood at the far edge of the ranch yard, small and still, silhouetted against the rising sun. Definitely not a burly drifter or seasoned ranch hand. As the figure walked closer, Jace's brows knit tightly. It wasn't a man. It wasn't even close. It was a girl, thin, dusty, and barefoot. Her feet were bare. He noticed that first because the ground was covered with tiny gravel and sun-baked dirt that could blister skin in minutes. Yet she walked as though pain was something she'd long ago learned to ignore. Her clothes were worn thin, edges frayed, and dusty as if she'd crossed half the prairie on foot. She carried nothing but the crumpled job notice in one hand, clutched between her fingers like it was the last solid thing she had in the world. For a moment, Jace simply stared. He wasn't a man easily startled, but this was something he couldn't even categorize. She stopped a few paces away from him, swallowed hard, and raised the paper like a shield. I came about the job," she said softly. Her voice was almost too quiet for the open air. Jace blinked. "The job? The ranch hand job?" She nodded, swallowing again. "Yes, sir." A gust of wind blew loose strands of her hair across her face. Up close he could see she was young, maybe 17, maybe 18, though her eyes carried a weariness that made her seem older. Dirt smudged her cheekbones, but beneath it he could see a face sharpened by survival, not softness. And yet there was something vulnerable there too, a flicker of hope wrapped in fear. Jace crossed his arms, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "Where's your horse?" "Your gear?" A strange look flashed across her face, embarrassment, maybe even shame. "I don't have any." He glanced again at her bare feet, at the torn hem of her dress, at the empty space where boots or supplies should have been. "You walked," he said. Not a question, but a realization. She nodded again. For a heartbeat, Jace couldn't speak. The nearest town was nearly 15 miles away. The road was rough, the sun unforgiving. No one walked it barefoot unless they had no other choice or no one to help them. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Lena," she said quietly. Just Lena. There was no last name offered. And something in the way she said just Lena told him she didn't want to explain. Maybe couldn't. Maybe was afraid to. He should have turned her away. Every instinct of practicality screamed it. She was small, unprepared, clearly hiding something. He needed strength, muscle, experience. Not a barefoot girl who looked like she might collapse if the wind blew too hard. But she didn't flinch under his gaze. Didn't beg. Didn't tremble. She simply stood there, steady and resolute, gripping the job notice like a lifeline. Jace found himself hesitating, not because she looked like she needed help, but because she looked like someone who had already survived more than she should have. For the first time, he wondered if posting that notice had been less of a business decision and more an invitation for fate to interfere. And fate, it seemed, had sent him Lena, barefoot, alone, and carrying a story she wasn't ready to speak. After the initial shock of Lena's unexpected arrival, Jace McAllister found himself in a position he hadn't planned for. A barefoot girl claiming she wanted the ranch hand job wasn't something any rancher expected or was prepared to handle. Yet something in her steady gaze had made him let her stay for the day, at least long enough to prove whether she could handle the simplest tasks. But the more hours passed, the more he realized there was something about Lena he couldn't pin down, something quiet, guarded, and heavy. When he brought her inside the ranch house for water, she hovered near the doorway like she wasn't sure she was allowed to cross its threshold. Her eyes flicked over the walls, the furniture, the dusty boots by the hearth, not with curiosity, but with the tense alertness of someone trained to memorize escape routes. "You can sit," Jace told her. She shook her head. I'm fine standing. Standing, barefoot, on wooden floors that probably felt like the softest surface she'd touched in weeks. Jace wasn't the type to pry, so he didn't push the issue. But he couldn't ignore the way she scanned the room before taking a sip of water, as if expecting a hand to strike her for some imagined mistake. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. Keeping his tone gentle. Her hand froze mid-lift. It was a simple question. Ordinary. But the reaction was anything but. Lena lowered the tin cup slowly and set it on the table, her posture stiffening like a fence post hammered into the ground. She didn't look at him when she answered. "Just traveling." "Most travelers have boots," he said. A small, almost invisible flinch crossed her shoulders. Jace regretted the comment immediately. He wasn't trying to shame her, just trying to understand. But some truths clearly pressed against wounds she wasn't ready to uncover. "And family?" he added more softly. "Anyone expecting you?" This time, Lena's throat worked like she was swallowing something sharp. "No," she said. "No one." Jace didn't miss the way her fingers curled into the fabric of her skirt, knuckles whitening, a sign of someone holding back more emotions than she could afford to release. She wasn't lying. She couldn't lie, not with eyes like that. But she was also leaving out the bigger truth. Something or someone had driven her here. Later that afternoon, when she followed him out to the corral, he observed her in silence. She moved quietly, always aware of her surroundings. Skittish the way a half-starved stray dog might be at first, too used to raised voices. Too used to danger, too unfamiliar with safety. When a horse snorted unexpectedly behind her, she flinched so hard she nearly dropped the bucket in her hands. Not the reaction of someone who'd grown up around livestock. Not the reaction of someone used to ranch work. But when Jace waited for her to give up, she only steadied herself, picked up the bucket again, and pressed on with stubborn determination. She wanted the job. Needed it. Maybe. At midday, Jace noticed thin scars along her forearms, faint but telling. Not the kind earned from normal chores or wild brush. Something else. Something harsher. "You ever worked ranch land before?" he asked. "No," she admitted. Her gaze lifted and held his. "But I can learn." It wasn't boastful. Wasn't desperate. It was simply the truth spoken by someone who had learned, long ago, that survival depended on adapting quickly. Jace didn't ask her anything more that day. He sensed the fragility of her trust like a glass set too close to an edge. One wrong word and she'd shatter or disappear. Instead, he let silence be the safe space between them, and in that silence, he realized something important. Lena wasn't just hiding a past. She was running from one. By the next morning, the prairie sun lifted itself over Lone Creek Ranch in a blaze of pale orange. And Jace McAllister still wasn't sure what to do with the barefoot girl who had shown up asking for a ranch hand job. A sensible man would have sent her back to town. A cautious man definitely would have. But Jace wasn't made of the kind of iron that let him turn someone away who clearly had nowhere else to go. Still, sympathy wasn't enough on a working ranch. Anyone who stayed had to pull their weight. So Jace decided he'd let Lena try just enough to see if she would break or hold. He expected her to struggle. He expected her to quit by midday. He was wrong on both counts. The morning started with hauling feed. Heavy sacks nearly half her weight stacked in the storage shed. Jace lifted two over his shoulder effortlessly, then turned to see how she would handle even one. Lena knelt beside a sack, tested its weight with her hands, and instead of trying to lift it all at once, she dragged it, inch by inch, across the floor. Dust rose around her, sticking to her skin, but she didn't stop until she had the sack where it needed to be. Then she wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, caught her breath, and reached for the next one. Jace watched silently from the doorway. Not amazed, not impressed, just affected. There was a difference. Most ranch hands bragged, beat their chests, showed off. Lena didn't speak unless spoken to. Didn't complain. Didn't flinch at work that would have made seasoned men swear. She moved with the quiet stubbornness of someone who had spent their whole life being told they couldn't, and had decided she'd prove otherwise even if her bones cracked from the effort. Word traveled fast. By noon, a few neighboring ranch hands rode over, curious to see the Barefoot girl working Lone Creek. Their smirks arrived before they did. "Well now," one called. Leaning on his saddle horn, didn't expect McAllister to be hiring children. Another snickered. Or maybe he's starting a charity instead of a ranch. Lena froze mid-task. That single moment, the way her shoulders drew tight, the way her breath trapped itself told Jace more about her past than anything she'd said. She was used to mockery, used to being dismissed, used to swallowing hurt so deep it had nowhere left to go. Jace walked past the men, jaw tight. "If you've come to help, grab a tool. If not, you can head home." They didn't stay long after that. When they were gone, Lena returned to her work without saying a word. But her movements had changed sharper, more determined. As if she wanted to prove she belonged here, even if the whole world said otherwise. Later, when the two of them worked the fence line, the sun high and hot, Jace offered her his extra pair of boots. "These'll be big on you, but better than blistering your feet raw." She hesitated, eyes flicking to the boots like she feared touching something she hadn't earned. "I'm fine," she said. But her bleeding heel betrayed the lie. Jace crouched, placing the boots gently beside her. "You don't have to bleed to prove anything to me." For a long moment, she stared at the boots the way one might stare at a gift they didn't believe they deserved. Then slowly, she slipped them on. They were too big, but she stood a little straighter wearing them. By sunset, Lena had done more in one day than Jace thought possible. She dragged feed, swept the barn, soothed a nervous mar, and hammered loose fence boards with small but capable hands. She didn't ask for praise. She didn't seek approval. But when Jace finally told her, "You did good today," he saw something flicker across her face, something small, fragile, and almost painful. Hope. It wasn't much. But it was the first step toward becoming part of Lone Creek. As days turned into weeks at Lone Creek Ranch, a rhythm began to settle in between Jace McAllister and Lena. The work was relentless sun rising before dawn. Chores stretching late into the evening, but the quiet routine gave them an unexpected chance to see each other in new ways. For Jace, it was a slow realization that the girl he had expected to be a burden was, in fact, proving herself capable, clever, and surprisingly resilient. For Lena, it was the first time she'd felt safe enough to let her guard lower, if only a fraction. Without the constant fear of judgment or cruelty, evenings became the most revealing. After the chores were done, the animals fed, and the barn quieted, Jace would sit on the wide wooden porch with a mug of coffee, and Lena would settle beside him, sometimes on the steps, sometimes just standing nearby, leaning lightly against the railing. They didn't talk at first. There was no need. The prairies stretched endlessly before them, the wind carrying the scent of wild grass and distant rain, and in that silence, a subtle companionship grew. It started with small observations. Jace would notice the way Lena's hands worked, roughened from labor, but careful when handling fragile things, like a newborn foal or a basket of eggs. Lena would notice the steadiness in Jace's voice when he gave instructions, the way he moved confidently through the ranch, and the occasional soft expression when he thought no one was looking. They began sharing fleeting smiles, quiet laughter over small mishaps, and the occasional challenge like seeing who could wrangle a particularly stubborn calf faster. Over time, their conversations deepened. Lena spoke cautiously, revealing fragments of herself in pieces, a favorite type of horse, a skill she had learned in passing, or the way she enjoyed simple tasks like tending flowers in small corners of the yard. Jace shared stories about the ranch, about his parents, and about the land itself, the history woven into every fence post, the memories carried in every pasture. They didn't need to talk about the pasts that hurt. Instead, they focused on what was present and what could be trusted. Yet, there were moments that revealed cracks in Lena's carefully constructed armor. A sudden loud shout from the barn, the snap of a branch, or the unexpected whistle of wind through the rafters would make her flinch. Jace began to notice these small, involuntary reactions, and he adjusted his expectations accordingly, never pushing too hard, never demanding explanations she wasn't ready to give. He simply offered quiet reassurance, sometimes with a nod, sometimes just by standing near enough that she could feel his presence without a word being spoken. These evenings also allowed them to glimpse each other's vulnerability. Lena began to ask small, tentative questions about the ranch, where things were stored, why certain fields were planted with certain crops, how to read the behavior of livestock. Jace, in turn, asked about her thoughts and observations during the day. They discovered an unspoken trust forming, a sense that each was dependable, that each would protect the other in the ways they knew how. For Lena, it was a startling experience to feel seen and safe. For Jace, it was equally startling to find himself caring deeply for someone whose arrival he had not expected to change his solitary life. As their bond strengthened, it became apparent that this was no ordinary employer-employee relationship. There was a subtle tension in the way their hands brushed while carrying tools, a warmth in shared glances, and a mutual understanding that went far beyond words. The prairie's endless horizon mirrored their cautious optimism, vast, uncertain, but full of possibility. In this quiet, shared space, they began to realize that they were no longer simply rancher and farmhand. They were partners in the truest sense, bound not by blood or obligation, but by the slowly growing trust and care that life on the ranch had forced them to forge. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold, Jace and Lena sat side by side on the porch steps. They no longer needed conversation to fill the silence. Words were unnecessary. Their bond had become something deeper, steady, quiet, and resilient. Like the ranch itself, the peace at Lone Creek Ranch, fragile and precious, was shattered one late afternoon when dust clouds appeared on the horizon, signaling riders approaching. Jace McAllister had seen his fair share of travelers, traders, ranch hands, and the occasional wandering gunslinger, but there was something in the deliberate, organized formation of these riders that set his nerves on edge. The wind carried their voices faintly, sharp with authority and accusation. Something told him that this was not a friendly visit. As the riders drew closer, their intentions became painfully clear. One man dismounted first, boots kicking up dry dirt as he strode toward the porch, his eyes scanning the land like he owned it. His companions followed, the distant sound of spurs echoing over the fields. Jace's hand instinctively hovered near the rifle resting against the railing. But even as his muscles tensed, a new wave of concern washed over him. He recognized the target and their mission before any words were spoken. "Jace McAllister?" The leader called, his tone flat but commanding. "That's me," Jace replied. His voice steady though his heart raced. "We're here for the girl," the man said, gesturing toward Lena, who had been standing quietly near the barn. "She belongs to the Ward homestead. They claim she ran away, and we've been sent to return her." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes, usually so controlled and guarded, widened with a mixture of fear and defiance. She had known this day might come, had feared it for weeks, but she had dared to hope it might not. The path she had tried to escape had followed her across miles of prairie, and now it had found her at the one place she had begun to trust. Jay studied the men carefully. The papers they carried might have been legal documents, but he knew that legality didn't always mean justice. He had learned over years of running Lone Creek Ranch that sometimes the right thing to do required more than obedience to the law. Protecting Lena, he realized, was now his responsibility, and the stakes had never been higher. "Where's your proof?" he asked, his voice low, measured, but firm. "You want to take her? Show me the law, not just your threats." The men produced worn papers, stamped and signed, but the documents did little to lessen the tension in the air. Lena's past, cruel and unrelenting, was laid bare in ink and official seal. But it could not capture her courage, her determination, or the life she had begun to build at Lone Creek. "You don't understand," Lena said suddenly, her voice quivering but strong. I can't go back there. They hurt me. I worked there until I had nothing left. I had to leave. Please don't make me go back." Her words struck Jace like a physical blow. The realization of what she had endured hardened his resolve. This wasn't a girl who needed to be returned. This was someone fighting for survival, for freedom, for a chance at life. And he couldn't let anyone take that away. He stepped in front of her, his broad frame shielding her from their sight. "She stays," he said. The tone left no room for negotiation. "If you want to take her, you'll have to take her from me. And I don't think you're willing to do that." The standoff stretched, tense and silent, with only the wind through the tall grass and the distant cries of livestock breaking the stillness. Lena, standing behind Jace, drew strength from his presence. For the first time, she felt that perhaps she had an ally in this vast, unpredictable world. The riders exchanged glances, realizing that their plans were not going to unfold easily. They had expected compliance, not resistance. And the stubbornness of one man standing for a barefoot girl disrupted their assumptions, changing the dynamic entirely. At that moment, the prairie seemed to hold its breath, suspended between fear and courage. Lena's future hung in the balance, and the quiet determination of both her and Jace hinted at the coming storm. This was not the end of her struggle, but the beginning of a reckoning, one that would test their resilience, their courage, and the growing bond between them. The sun was dipping low over the Lone Creek horizon, painting the prairie in deep amber and blood-orange streaks, as Jace McAllister stood firmly in the yard, shielding Lena from the approaching riders. The men from the Ward homestead had arrived with legal papers and heavy expectations, believing that the law and their numbers were enough to bend both the girl and the rancher to their will. They were wrong. Jace had spent years surviving on the prairie, navigating storms, predators, and isolation. But nothing had tested him like this. Nothing had demanded the courage to confront, not just physical danger but moral responsibility. Lena, standing a step behind him, looked fragile at first glance, but her wide, determined eyes revealed a quiet strength that mirrored the untamed land around them. Protecting her was no longer just a choice, it was an obligation, born out of respect, compassion, and a sense of justice that refused to bend. The leader of the riders stepped forward, waving the papers in the air as though their mere presence could compel obedience. "Jace McAllister, we have the law on our side," he said, his voice sharp. "Return the girl or face the consequences." Jace's jaw tightened. He didn't need legal documents to understand the truth. The papers might claim ownership, but they couldn't erase the cruelty Lena had suffered, the freedom she had earned simply by escaping. The law, in this case, was blind to justice. And Jace, hardened by life on the ranch, had learned that sometimes the right path required standing against the law when it conflicted with what was moral. "She stays," Jace said, his voice low, steady, and filled with authority. "I won't let you take her back. Not for law, not for threat, not for anything." The men exchanged glances, realizing that their intimidation might not work. The usual tactics, bluster, fear, even force, had no effect on this man, standing firm for someone he had only just met. Jace's presence was unyielding, like a cliff face that refused to be eroded by wind or water. Lena, meanwhile, drew courage from his resolve. The first real sense of safety she had felt in years. Tension crackled in the air as one of the riders muttered under his breath about how stubborn ranchers could be dangerous. Jace knew that he couldn't rely on words alone. He positioned himself in front of Lena, broad and uncheckable, making it clear that any attempt to take her would be met with resistance. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was prepared to defend her with everything he had: muscle, gun, and the relentless determination of a man who had spent his life on the unforgiving prairie. Lena watched, awe and gratitude mingling with fear. She had never had anyone stand up for her like this before. Most people either ignored her suffering or dismissed it. Jace, however, had chosen to act, not out of obligation, but because it was right. That choice, bold and uncompromising, made her truly believe that she could have a place where she belonged. The riders hesitated, weighing their options. They had the law on their side, but they lacked the courage, conviction, and stubbornness of a man willing to fight for a girl he barely knew. Jace, sensing their indecision, didn't flinch. He didn't waver. He simply stood, resolute, a human barrier between Lena and the cruelty of her past. In that moment, the ranch felt alive with tension, each whisper of wind and rustle of grass amplifying the standoff. This wasn't just about ownership, it was about freedom, justice, and trust. And Jace was making it clear that freedom, once won, would not be taken back without a fight. Finally, the riders, recognizing the futility of a direct confrontation, retreated with muttered threats and scowls. Jace exhaled slowly, lowering his arms but keeping his gaze fixed on the road they had taken. Lena stepped forward, her bare or barely shod feet touching the dusty ground with renewed confidence. She didn't speak immediately. Words weren't necessary. They had both understood the unspoken truth. Some battles weren't just fought with force, they were fought with courage, conviction, and the refusal to surrender to injustice. That evening, as the prairie sun sank behind the hills, Lena and Jace shared a quiet understanding. A bond had been forged not through casual conversation or shared work, but through the crucible of confrontation. He had taken a stand for her, and in doing so, he had changed both their lives forever. The prairie night fell over Lone Creek Ranch like a velvet curtain, swallowing the land in shadows that danced with the light of a pale crescent moon. Jace McAllister and Lena stood in silence on the porch, listening to the distant hoofbeats and the rustle of grass that hinted at the retreat of the Ward Homestead riders. Though the immediate threat had withdrawn, Jace knew it was only a matter of time before they returned with greater force. Waiting passively was no longer an option. Lena's freedom, fragile and newly won, demanded action. "Tonight," Jace said quietly, his voice steady but low, "we leave. We can't risk staying here." He didn't need to explain why. Lena already understood. The fear in her eyes, the memories she carried, and the exhaustion of running from those who sought to control her, all of it told him she was ready. She didn't need coaxing. She needed escape. Packing light, they moved under the cover of darkness, each step deliberate, careful not to make a sound that could betray them. Lena's bare feet, now hardened from weeks of prairie life, made her movements surprisingly quiet, though Jace insisted she keep a light cloth over them to prevent injuries from unseen stones or thorns. They carried only essentials: water, a small blanket, and the few personal items Lena had deemed indispensable. Every movement was precise, honed by necessity. Both knew that a mistake could cost them dearly, The first few miles were a tense silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through tall grass and the occasional call of a distant owl. Lena clung to Jace's side, her small hand occasionally brushing his arm, a subconscious gesture of trust and reliance. He didn't comment. He didn't need to. In that quiet, unspoken understanding, their bond strengthened further. Shaped by danger and shared determination as they traversed the rolling hills. Lena's breathing occasionally quickened. Memories of her captors flickering in her mind. Every shadow seemed like a threat, every distant sound a harbinger of pursuit. Jace, aware of her unease, remained vigilant, scanning the horizon and listening to the subtle changes in the landscape that could indicate danger. He guided her through safe paths he knew from years of life on the prairie-hidden ravines, abandoned line shacks, and dry creek beds that offered cover from any potential trackers. By midnight, fatigue began to press upon them. Lena's legs ached from constant movement, and Jace's own muscles burned from hours of guiding, carrying, and remaining alert. Yet neither stopped. Stopping meant vulnerability, and vulnerability was a luxury they could not afford. Every careful step brought them closer to temporary safety, and every mile reinforced their shared determination to survive. Along the way, their conversations were sparse but meaningful. Lena spoke in fragments, quiet recollections of what had driven her from the Ward homestead, small dreams of freedom, fleeting memories of safety she had never known until now. Jace responded with practical advice and small reassurances, yet beneath his pragmatic words was a growing admiration for her courage. She was not just surviving. She was learning to reclaim herself, step by cautious step. Under the most trying circumstances, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon as they finally reached the shelter of a secluded canyon, hidden by natural cliffs and dense underbrush. Exhausted but relieved, they paused, catching their breath and allowing themselves a moment of reprieve. Lena sank to the ground, finally letting the weight of fear and exhaustion wash over her. And Jace knelt beside her, offering water and quiet encouragement. In that still, hidden place, they shared a rare intimacy, not romantic yet, but deeply human. Trust had been forged in fire, courage had been tested by necessity, and hope, fragile and tentative, began to root itself in their hearts. They were not yet safe, but for the first time, Lena could imagine a future where she was not hunted, and Jace could envision a life not entirely solitary. The night escape had not only preserved her freedom, it had drawn them closer, intertwining their fates in ways that neither could have foreseen. The canyon remained quiet, a secret refuge for two souls standing against a cruel past. And though danger still lurked beyond the hills, the bond formed in flight would carry them forward, ready to face whatever challenges awaited. The return to Lone Creek Ranch was fraught with tension, though the air was deceptively calm. Jace McAllister and Lena had spent the night hiding in the canyon, evading the riders who sought to claim her. But they both knew the respite was temporary. Word of her escape would spread quickly, and the Ward homestead would not give up so easily. As they approached the familiar gate of the ranch in the early morning light, Jace felt a surge of determination. This was his home, Lena's refuge, and they would face whatever came together. The riders arrived not long after, Gust rising behind them like a warning banner. They were more numerous this time, emboldened by the assumption that law and numbers could force compliance. Jace met them in the yard, the sight of Lena beside him a silent declaration. She was not alone, and she would not go quietly. The tension between them was palpable, a charged atmosphere that made the horses snort nervously and the prairie wind hold its breath. Jace McAllister, the leader, barked, dismounting with a flourish. Return the girl now. You know the law is on our side. Jace squared his shoulders. The law doesn't define justice. She stays. A flicker of surprise passed through the riders' eyes. They had assumed that fear or legal authority could bend any man, but they hadn't counted on Jace's unyielding resolve. This was more than stubbornness. It was moral conviction, a refusal to allow cruelty to claim the innocent. Lena, standing beside Jace, felt a surge of courage she had never known. The fear that had gripped her for months threatened to return, but she realized that this was her moment to reclaim her voice. Stepping slightly forward, she spoke with a clarity and strength that surprised even herself. "I won't go back," she said, her voice ringing across the yard. They hurt me. I was made to work until I had nothing left. I can't return. I am not theirs." Her words cut through the tension, shocking the riders. They had assumed that a frightened girl would be silent, compliant, or panicked, but Lena was neither. She was standing tall, articulating her truth, and asserting her right to freedom. For the first time, the weight of her past was given words. No longer trapped in silent fear, Jace felt a swell of pride and protectiveness. He had offered her refuge, but now she had claimed it herself. Her courage was a reflection of the strength he had seen in her since the moment she first arrived at Lone Creek. Together, they formed an unspoken alliance, his unwavering support and her newfound voice. They were no longer just rancher and farmhand. They were partners, united against injustice. The riders hesitated, unsure of how to respond to a girl asserting herself so boldly. Their legal claim was solid on paper, but law alone could not overcome resolve, nor the ethical certainty of right versus wrong. Jace stepped closer, making it clear that any attempt to seize her by force would be met with resistance. The standoff stretched, time itself seeming to slow, the prairie holding every breath in suspended tension. Finally, with muttered threats and scowls, the riders realized the futility of confrontation. They mounted their horses and rode off, the dust settling behind them like the fading grip of fear. The ranch, once threatened, remained intact. A sanctuary reclaimed through courage, strategy, and moral fortitude. As the quiet returned to Lone Creek, Lena sank to the porch steps, exhausted but resolute. Jace knelt beside her, offering water and reassurance, his presence a steadfast anchor in the aftermath of danger. The ordeal had tested them both, Jace's resolve, Lena's courage, but it had also solidified their bond. She had found her voice, he had found purpose in defending it. And together they had faced the storm and emerged stronger. The standoff at Lone Creek was more than a confrontation. It was a turning point. Lena was no longer defined by fear or past oppression. Jace had proven himself a protector, but Lena had proven herself capable of standing up for her own life. The ranch was safe, for now, but more importantly, Lena had claimed a home, a voice, and a freedom that no law or threat could take away. The sun rose gently over Lone Creek Ranch the morning after the standoff, casting warm golden light across the fields, fences, and livestock. For the first time in weeks, the prairie felt calm. The threat from the Ward homestead had been driven away, at least for now, and the ranch itself seemed to breathe a quiet sigh of relief. Yet amidst the tranquility, a new reality was taking root, one that promised something both delicate and profound. Home. Lena sat on the porch steps, her bare or now slightly worn feet resting on the warm wood. The ordeal of the past days weighed heavily on her, yet a subtle transformation was evident. The fear that had defined her life for so long had not vanished entirely, but it had been tempered by courage, trust, and a newfound sense of belonging. She looked across the yard at Jace McAllister, whose presence had become both anchor and shield in ways she could never have anticipated. The ranch, once a place of labor and isolation, had become a sanctuary because of him, and more importantly, because of the trust they had cultivated together. Jace approached her slowly, carrying a small basket of food. He didn't speak immediately. He simply set it beside her, the act itself a quiet affirmation of his role as protector and companion. "You okay?" he asked finally, his voice low and careful, aware of the fragility of this new piece. Lena nodded, though the gesture was more symbolic than complete. "I think so," she admitted softly. Her eyes flicked toward the fields and fences, to the barns and livestock, everything she had helped care for over the past weeks. In that glance, Jace saw more than relief. He saw pride. For the first time, Lena could see herself not as someone fleeing, but as someone rooted in a place where she could grow and thrive. The conversation, quiet and unhurried, turned toward the future. Jace made no grand promises he didn't need to. Instead, he offered her a choice. "You don't have to stay because you owe me," he said, his eyes steady. "You stay because this is your home now if you want it. Room, board, work. And something more if you want it." Lena felt a surge of emotions, relief, gratitude, and something deeper, almost frightening in its intensity, hope. For so long, she had existed in a state of survival, reacting to each threat, each cruelty, each step of her uncertain journey. But here, in the quiet light of the morning, she realized she had a choice. She could stay, she could belong, and she could finally envision a life that was hers to live. She smiled faintly, the expression tentative but genuine. "I want to stay," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I want to be here, with you, with the ranch." There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a quiet certainty born from the trials she had faced and the trust she had learned to place in Jace. In that moment, the ranch transformed. It was no longer merely a stretch of land defined by fences and barns. It became a home not just in structure, but in spirit, a place where two lives had intersected and built something enduring. Lena, once a girl defined by fear and displacement, had found a sanctuary. Jace, once a solitary rancher, had found companionship and purpose beyond labor and routine. Days turned into weeks, and life at Lone Creek settled into a new rhythm. Lena continued to work alongside Jace, her skills growing, her confidence solidifying. But beyond chores and cattle, there was laughter, quiet conversations on the porch, and the comfort of shared silences. Together, they repaired fences not only of wood but of trust and belonging. The past, though never entirely forgotten, had been left behind in the dust of the prairie, replaced by resilience, hope, and love, simple, enduring, and wholly earned as the sun set over Lone Creek, painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Lena and Jace stood together at the edge of the fields, looking out over the land they both now called home. She had found safety, freedom, and a place to grow. He had found partnership, trust, and someone who had challenged his solitude in ways he never expected. And in that shared horizon, stretched wide and unbroken, they both understood a truth deeper than words. Some homes are not merely built, they are earned, protected, and chosen. And for Lena, for Jace, for the ranch, this was a home forever,